as an arbitration centre, what can we do to compete and make ourselves better? What innovative solutions can the BVI offer which will attract arbitration above our immediate competitors?
Well, I guess I bring a perspective of struggle to the answer to that question, because my role until a year ago was president of the Australian Centre for International Commercial Arbitration and the leader of the push to develop Sydney in particular as a centre for international arbitration in our region, and doing so in the context of very heavy government investment, financially and otherwise, in Hong Kong and Singapore. And we have had the challenges that you have in deploying the enormous skills which are available in Australia, the lawyers, the facilities, the judges, and the arbitration law. I mean, we were one of the first countries after Canada to adopt the model law, and we've had it for just slightly longer than you have. We were also an early adopter of the New York Convention. And what we have found is that it is a very competitive market, despite the significant advantages that we have in Australia. We suffer something we call the tyranny of distance. It's easy to get to Australia, and it probably takes as long to get to Australia from Toronto as it does to get here. Yet people think it's a long way to Australia. They don't have that immediate impression about the BVI, although they will develop it unless you do something about it, and I'm sure you can quite quickly. So we have the tyranny of distance, which is an issue. But what we set about doing was identifying the market to which we could sell Australia, and Sydney in particular, as a neutral venue for the decision of international commercial disputes between parties who had nothing to do with Australia. And we are succeeding, slowly, but nevertheless steadily, in persuading parties to choose it. And the approach that we adopted was to look for what, for us, represented an offering of neutrality, having already established the key building blocks for an arbitration centre: the law, the user-friendly judiciary, the facilities, and the centre that we established in Sydney. And what we said is, look, if you're dealing with the monolith of China in Asia, or in the Asia Pacific, or indeed in the Middle East, and you're looking for a place which is truly neutral, you won't go to Hong Kong and you won't go to Singapore, because the pervasive influence of the Chinese government in both those places is easily recognised. You will come to Australia. And then we went to China, and we said, you may be finding parties to your transactions who are looking for a neutral venue. We're ideal for you. And I think we developed, in China for instance, an acceptability of Sydney in particular as an option in the negotiation of the clause, if they were forced away from their preferred option, of course, of arbitration in China. Now, what do you have in terms of the niche? You see perhaps a little bit of a resemblance, I think, to the issues you face, to Mauritius. You know, Mauritius is seeking to establish itself as the centre for arbitration for Africa. And those of you that have been to Mauritius will readily recognise that it isn't in Africa. and it's quite some distance from Africa. But their market ploy is that there's no safe place to arbitrate in Africa. And although there are very significant numbers of arbitrations being conducted in Nigeria and some other places, South Africa has lost the opportunity to develop a modern arbitration centre, deliberately so. So they say, we're the place for arbitration in Africa. And so a holiday resort becomes, they hope, an arbitration centre. Although I should warn you about two things about Mauritius. The first is that in-house counsel say they daren't suggest Mauritius as a seat for arbitration for fear of being accused by shareholders of looking for a holiday. And secondly, if you go to Mauritius, you will find a less than up-to-speed court system, and you will find a less than fully developed legal community. If you want to go to court in Mauritius, your choices are quite limited. Now, I think you have here solutions to both those problems, because people don't necessarily think of the BVI as a holiday resort. I mean, it is known as a place to come, but it also has a very legitimate business activity associated with it, which is a real possibility. What do you have to offer that, say, Mauritius is trying to offer and which we in Australia are trying to offer? Well, I think you clearly have identified, and Jerry has cleverly put, the proposition that you should build off the corporate structures that you have here, recognising, as Justice Leon has said, that there is serious issues in shareholder disputes regarding getting all the parties into an arbitration. But with appropriate arbitration clauses, you might do that. So that gives you a natural constituency to start with. But I think that Calvin put his finger on a very important issue earlier, and that is a regional offering for arbitration. What other jurisdictions are there in the Caribbean which have what you've got? A well-established legal system, a judiciary clearly independent and expert in the field, and a developed system for advocacy with a profession that is very competent. I'm not an expert in this region, but I suspect that that may be a relatively unique commodity in the region. And one of the things that is worth thinking about is this. There are very significant natural and other resources projects which will be done here, and where governments have the opportunity to influence where those disputes will be decided, as they certainly are doing in Qatar, which has been mentioned. And who'd want to arbitrate in Qatar if they had a choice? That's a good question. You have the chance to actually work in a cooperative way with the governments in the region to try and encourage them to keep their disputes in the region. The reason that Singapore and Hong Kong have been so successful is that the momentum of trade flows has moved to Asia. And so parties in Asia are asking, if we're doing a deal as a Korean company with an Indian company, why would we bother going to London? Why don't we keep it in the region? And you can also do the same. However, as an Australian, I am readily familiar with the jealousies that occur within the same country that's large, within a federation. Trying to keep our Western Australian and Victorian and Queensland friends on board with a sales job for Sydney is quite an exercise. And you only have to look at the US and Canada to see absolute disaster in terms of the promotion of the business of arbitration. New York competes with Miami, competes with Atlanta, competes with Houston, competes with Los Angeles, And Los Angeles competes with San Francisco. And then, of course, everyone from Vancouver thinks everyone coming from Toronto is coming to get them. So the issue of jealousy within regions is something that you have to be really careful. And I've put an enormous amount of effort in Australia into keeping together a coalition of the willing from across those jealousies. And I think that if you were to put some effort, and I don't understand the politics, and you do, into developing a coalition regionally, you would have an additional string to your bow beyond that of financial services.
Thank you, Doug. That's really very helpful indeed. And just keeping on the government topic for a moment, Jerry, red carpet or red tape? How's the government supporting this initiative?
I suppose I should start off with a disclaimer: I'm not part of the government.
You say that.
And you're not here to help. That's an in-joke for people who were here last night.
Thank you very much for that one. Well, let me come to that very quickly. But before I do, I think I wish to say something about the regional aspect, which Doug has touched on and carved in. I think that's a very important element. But I believe that you would very well find that if we were to be selling the idea of becoming an international arbitration center to the government on the basis that the primacy of our work, of our business, will be coming from the region, I think we would fail in selling it. That's not to say that that is not an important element, because what we see also across the region is that there's an ever-growing sophistication in relation to commerce and business activity, and the types of documents and agreements that are entered into by businesses across the region, and some of them doing very substantial business within the region and outside the region now. And so there is perhaps potentially a growing market there, and there's no good reason why the BVI should not position itself as it has been able to do effectively in relation to incorporations, to be the place, the jurisdiction for arbitration services in the wider region, including, of course, Guyana. But there are a number of things that we need to address in the BVI to become, as it were, more user-friendly. I mean, we've spoken to some of the disadvantages or limitations, access to the BVI, and so on and so forth. And of course, we don't have a major business hotel property on Tortola, something that has been talked about in higher circles for some time. This facility here certainly has taken a step in that direction, and could very well be made, at least in the interim, to be the preferred property for the purposes of that type of business, as it is in relation to lawyers coming in and staying in the BVI. But there are procedural and to some extent legal aspects that we need to address as well. And one of the concerns, of course, is how friendly are we in welcoming and accepting people into the territory. I don't mean friendly in the sense of meeting persons one-on-one and how they react or interact with you. I think we have a stellar reputation in that regard here in the BVI. But certainly from the point of view of the procedures in order to get into the BVI and to work in the BVI and so on. And the Premier this morning in his address touched on a number of these issues, in particular relating to immigration and labor. What he neglected to say is that I have been given the unenviable task of being the sponsor of that committee to reform immigration and labor as it relates to procedures and laws in the BVI. And we are very much in the troves of addressing those issues And we have had a wide consultation with the business community, particularly as it relates to financial services here in the BVI, in order to inform our deliberations as a committee. And I'm pleased to say, I must say, that we have here with us the Labor Commissioner, Mrs. Reimer, who is attending the conference here today. There's clearly a need for simplification of the processes in terms of getting approvals. And one of the areas which, in particular, my committee has been asked to look at is simplification of the procedures and processes as it relates to persons who will be coming here for the purposes of conducting arbitration and providing those services here in the BVI. How do we facilitate their entry into the territory and their stay while they're here, and so on and so forth. So that is going to be a particular targeted area in terms of the recommendations, bearing in mind this overall initiative of giving emphasis to expanding the offerings in the BVI to include international arbitration services and indeed an international arbitration center. So that's an area of key concern and one that must be addressed. Also, I think we have to be cognizant that to a growing extent, even litigation is now being conducted without parties and other participants actually being all present in court. And the question is, what does that mean for us as building the business as an arbitration center? I know we are looking, of course, to all of the spin-off financial and multiplier benefits to the economy for persons coming to the BVI here for the purposes of international disputes resolution through arbitration. And that is something that we want to foster and to indeed grow substantially. But we also have to recognize that if we are going to be competitive as an international arbitration center, we must offer the plethora of services and facilities to those who we are seeking to attract and the business that we are seeking to attract to ensure that we are indeed competitive. And that involves, of course, at times certain aspects of proceedings being conducted through video link or some other electronic means. And we have to ensure in that regard that our telecommunication services, in particular in the BVI, are up to snuff in terms of modern international standards. And I think we'll all agree that we are not there in the BVI. The irony is that one of the advantages which the BVI had in the early years to promote the financial services industry was our telecommunication services at that time, as compared with other places in the region. But we have fallen behind in that regard. We now have to be judged by not just regional standards, but international standards in that regard. And certainly there's a dire need for significant improvement there, something which also is part of the initiative which the Premier spoke about this morning in his address to us.
Well, thanks, Joe. That's excellent. And obviously we've got challenges, but these challenges, importantly, are being met. We're looking at telecoms, we're looking at a state-of-the-art centre, we've got the legislation in place, and hopefully logistics too.